Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. Good evening, maybe, everybody. I am really delighted to be to open this webinar. My name is Ildikó Horváth, and I'm president of the EMCI Consortium. I am delighted and honored, really, to be here with you today. I think this is a unique event. At least it is a unique event in the history of the EMCI Consortium, which is a consortium that was set up more than 20 years ago by the European institutions. At present, we have 16 members. For those who don't know us, very briefly, I would like to tell you that we have 16 members in Europe. For the last year, we have had to, as everybody, move our activities online. Normally, we have offline activities. We have training of trainers, seminars, general assemblies, student meetings, teacher mobility. But for the last year, we have been doing it online, of course. And this webinar is part of our activities, online activities. And this is the second webinar we are organizing. We organized one for the first time in November last year with the presentation of one of our trainers from one of our member schools from the University of Trieste. Cristina Scardula told us about her research results in the field of English as a lingua franca. Today is naturally our second webinar on sign language conference interpreting, professionalization, and course design. I am really glad to tell you that we have passed the bar of 500 registered participants, because exactly 504 participants have registered to our webinar today from all over the world. So it is unique again, because this is one of our first global events. I am really, and not only me, all of my colleagues are really excited about today's webinar. Not only because this has become large, but because this is this webinar we are organizing in cooperation with IEIC Sign Language Network. And here I would like to present one of our main partners in this in the organization of this webinar, who is Maya David. I am sure that she doesn't need any introduction to many of you, but for those of you who don't know her, she is the coordinator of IEIC's Sign Language Network. She's a trainer, a consultant, a researcher, and an interpreter with Dutch Sign Language, American Sign Language, International Sign in her language combination, and Dutch, English, and German. There are no words to describe Maya, our gratitude and our thanks to you, because really we are amazed really with your efforts and enthusiasm and professionalism since the beginning we contacted you. So thank you really, really from the bottom of our hearts, really, for all your efforts. I would also like to thank our panelists and our interpreters in advance for their work. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Maya. Maya, the floor is yours, and thank you once more.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this very, very special webinar. I'm very delighted to be here and to have the honor to moderate this joint webinar with EMCI. It was an absolutely pleasure when I received the email if I wanted to moderate this, because I have been trying to get on the agenda of sign language, or actually conference language interpreting programs, to also get next to spoken languages, also sign languages as one of the choices in the interpreting programs. So now that we have so many highly qualified conference interpreting programs around the world, and also at master level, and especially here in Europe with EMCI. I think this is an amazing opportunity and a first to actually discuss how do we actually do this. Because we have a lot of experience with spoken language interpreters, but how does this actually work with sign language interpreters? How is that an option when you add this as one of the languages in your teaching program? So we have a wonderful panel here who can tell you all more about this. But before we do so, I would like to remind you actually of how to access this panel or this webinar. So if we can go back one slide, Agnes, then we just see again how you can access. So for those who speak Spanish and Portuguese, at the bottom, you see the interpretation button where you can actually listen, or if you just want to listen in how our wonderful colleagues are interpreting into Spanish and into Portuguese. On screen, you see my colleagues, International Sign Interpretation, who will be providing interpretation into International Sign and from International Sign into Spanish and English. Then if you have any tech issues, please use the chat function. We do not answer any questions in the chat function, but the chat function is to say hi to everyone and for any tech issues that you have. And as you can see, we have our tech person here, who is Mark Schofield. If there's any issues, he will be happy to help you with any tech. Then if you have any question for our panelists, I would kindly ask you to use, if you speak English, Slido. So if you go to Slido, you see on the screen, you can actually see in the orange button, the code. I'll read it out. It's SLCI 1902, 1902, the date of today. So please feel free to ask any questions that you might have. If you speak Spanish or Portuguese, we ask you to use the Q&A function at the bottom for your questions. So we are now happy to start our panel, and I'm happy to introduce you to our first panelist. She was unable to attend, but she has made every effort possible to give you all her information. She will be presenting in International Sign, and she has video recorded her presentation. Plus, she has also English subtitles as well as spoken English added to the presentation. She is Nadja Hinkova, and she is actually this Czech sign language interpreter, and I have known her for many, many years when I've been to the Czech Republic several times. So it's an absolute delight to have her. She is now also teaching sign language interpreters at the university, and she is a member of many professional interpreter organizations in her country and around Europe. So thank you, and let's hear it from Nadja now.
Hello, my name is Nadja Hinkova, and I am first and foremost a sign language interpreter who started learning the job from practice. I haven't gotten my formal interpreting education until much later. I have also worked as a teacher of sign language interpreters and a researcher at the Faculty of Arts of Charles University in Prague since the year 2000. I am also a proud member of several interpreters' organizations in the fields of both signed and spoken languages. In the Czech Republic, we can talk about the progress of sign language interpreting as a profession since the establishment of Deaf Studies as a university program at Charles University in 1988. It became the center as well as driving force of systematic research into sign languages and its application into practice, including interpreting. Since the year 2000, important deaf-led organizations teaching Czech Sign Language have been established, as well as the Professional Organization of Sign Language Interpreters. Ever since, there has been successful collaboration between deaf and hearing professionals in the area of sign language interpreter education. In 2004, the first certified educational program for sign language interpreters came into existence and was coordinated by the professional organization. Various lessons were taught by deaf lecturers, as well as university teachers and spoken language interpreters from the Institute of Translation Studies. The joint efforts had a tangible outcome. In 2008, almost 80 books were published on paper, DVDs, or online, which then formed the basis of sign language interpreter education in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. There are three main pillars of sign language interpreter education in the Czech Republic: university education, education organized by deaf associations, and education organized by sign language interpreters organizations. The significance and, so to say, importance of each of these pillars change over time. Currently, the university education is definitely predominant. Despite much effort at university level education, there are still many limitations that we would like to overcome in the future. First, at the moment, there are only undergraduate bachelor's degree programs where sign language interpreting can be studied, either as one of the classes included in deaf studies at the Faculty of Arts of Charles University in Prague, or as a full 3-year sign language interpreting program, newly opened at the Masaryk University in Brno. There are currently no MA level programs. There have been attempts to open an MA program in Prague, but there are very harsh requirements concerning accreditation and personnel that we are not able to meet for now. We will see if that changes in the future. Second issue. Applicants coming into the bachelor's degree program are not required to have any entry level of sign language skills. And it is very difficult to learn the language as well as interpreting skills in only 3 years. This could be solved by having a subsequent MA program. Third issue. There is not enough emphasis on learning English during the study program. Given the frequency of international events and conferences in today's time, the current and future generation of sign language interpreters should be proficient in English. This could be solved by cooperation with university's Department of Translation Studies. Fourth issue. International Sign is included in the program only as an optional class, which is also fairly short. There should be more emphasis on learning IS, and IS should be also included in interpreting exercises as well as English. Also, the knowledge of another national sign language would be useful to the students. Fifth issue. The students need more opportunities to practice their skills at real events and conferences. We have had several conferences where our students worked alongside sign language interpreters, both hearing and deaf, and spoken language interpreters as well. For example, we had a great experience during the conference for the 20th anniversary of Deaf Studies at Charles University. At events like this, students can observe the work of the interpreting team, as well as practice interpreting on site themselves, record their practice, and later on analyze their work with a teacher. They need more events like this, especially with international attendance. Putting these issues aside, now, based on my 20 years of experience, I would like to summarize some basic guidelines for sign language interpreter education. First, experts from the deaf community have to be included. The lessons have to be developed in cooperation with members of the community. It is obvious that sign language is taught by deaf teachers only. Translation exercises are led by deaf and hearing teacher. Second, Sign language interpreter education has to be realized in cooperation with experts on spoken language interpreting. We have had good experience with cooperation with the Department of Translation Studies. It is valuable for students of both programs to interact. Some of the lessons for sign language interpreters could be inspired by lessons for spoken language interpreters and vice versa. Third, sign language interpreters need to cooperate with professional organizations of both sign and spoken language interpreting during their education as well as after joining the profession. Fourth, we have to constantly keep in mind the changing needs of our deaf clients. Education has to be based on feedback from the community, not on the needs of the interpreters. Fifth, we also have to be able to react accordingly to current political and social situation. In March 2020, with the coronavirus pandemic, there was all of a sudden a need for a team of interpreters working in the media and government institutions. This would not have been possible to achieve without the help of deaf professionals. We got an enormous support from deaf presenters and editors working on our national TV, making the news in Czech Sign Language. Thanks to this support, a team of 12 interpreters was successfully created. And lastly, I would like to mention that international and interdisciplinary cooperation and exchange of experiences is also crucial. Thank you very much for today's online event. I hope we will be soon able to meet in person as well. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you to Nadja for making this possible. I think she really addressed key points, and it's a great introduction to this webinar. And I'm sure the panelists coming up have lots of elements that they can address more in detail. And the next panelist that I would like to introduce to you is Gemini Napier. So Gemini Napier is a professor, director and center at the Center for Translation and Interpreting Studies in Scotland at Heriot-Watt University. She's a researcher, she's an educator and a practitioner. She is also an accredited sign language interpreter, and she works between IS, BSL, and Auslan, and she has been a practitioner for over 30 years. She's also a member of AIIC, and I have to add that she's also my PhD supervisor. So I'm very, very honored to have her. Gemini, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maya. Okay, can everybody see my slides? Great. And can everyone hear Oliver, my voice? Good. Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me today. I'm thrilled to be here, and this is a wonderful event. As Maya said, this has been a long time coming. Spoken language interpreting and sign language interpreting have lived in their own silos for way too long, and we need to encourage this much more interaction. And now that we're seeing this cooperation today, it's a delight to be here. So I've been invited to speak about a project that I'm coordinating from Heriot-Watt University here in Scotland. And this is in partnership with the European Commission, and we'll hear Kathy Pearson talk about their part and their role in all of this as well later on. So the project has given us funding from the Commission, and it's called EMCI for short. And today I'll explain to you the details of that project. So to give a bit of background about this project, what we're seeing is an increased demand for high-level work what we call CHLM, sorry, which is conferences and high-level meetings. So what we're seeing is an exponential demand for interpreters working at these meetings, and that could be at the European Parliament, at the European Commission, or other political events. And we're seeing international sign interpreters and being requested a lot more than they were before. So of course, what we need are well-trained conference interpreters who work in these sign languages. So conferences and high-level meetings is, or CALM, the acronym, was taken from somebody else who I work with, called Gary Quinn. So I'd like to just acknowledge him for coining the term CALM. Maya's PhD is looking at several things. One of them is a survey where she asked many working sign language interpreters who work in IS at conferences who do not have formal accreditation. The commission said that they want to increase the number of interpreters who are appropriate to work at that level. Now, in looking around, there wasn't a lot of formal training. There might be one module as a part of an MA. There might be a conference interpreting module for the BSL interpreters. So little bits here and there, but nothing comprehensive. We tend to, we see programs that teach sign language and spoken language interpreters together, but we don't have anything dedicated to conference sign language interpreters. So SCIC, the interpreting department at the European Commission, decided to invest some money into this project, which would essentially make that training a reality. So the aim of the EMCI project is to create a curriculum for high-level, multilingual sign and spoken language interpreters working at high-level meetings. So 1 year ago, we got approval for the funding, and we wanted to bring in a number of people for a short time, for only 5 days, so that they could have some type of certificate or accreditation to work in these meetings. We do have the WASLI WFD accredited list of interpreters. So this was our plan for last year, to train 20 interpreters who were already working but didn't have qualification. So we wanted to enlarge that pool. And we asked several organizations, WASLI, WFD, EFSLI, EUD. So it was important that we had deaf and sign language interpreting organizations input in terms of what did they think should be taught in a conference sign language interpreter program. So we collected all of their feedback, and we got ready to teach, and Corona was thrust upon us. And since then, everything has been put on hold. In the meantime, I've been in discussion with SCIC and the commission to adjust the planning for the program, and therefore this will happen later this year. Again, just for a short amount of time. So there's a lot of work to be done to create this into an actual MA program. At Heriot-Watt, we already have an MA in spoken language conference interpreting, which includes Chinese, Russian, French, Spanish, to name a few. So we have that experience here. So Heriot-Watt is actually a perfect catalyst to help enlarge the pool, because we have the resources to plan with our spoken language colleagues this program in terms of how and what we would teach. So here you can see the project timeline, and this has been the result of a lot of discussion, and this started in December of 2019. And then, as I said, things had to be adjusted because of the pandemic, and there's a project officer who is focusing on collecting IS examples to create more of a corpus for the interpreters to work from, if they're working into International Sign or into English. We do obviously have a very large corpus of English that we can work from, but we don't have a lot of appropriate International Sign materials to teach from. So we're now planning to teach the short course. We thought it would be 5 days at first, but because we're having to shift online, the university has said that we can't use the center. So we're figuring out how to adapt that to online, and we're hoping to teach that short course in May and June. So there will be an evaluation phase of the booster course, and we're hoping to start a new postgraduate program in September of next year. I have a meeting tomorrow, or 2 days, after the weekend, to further the development of the project and to make another proposal. So we'd like to have a postgraduate certificate that would then obviously build the pool and also build up to become an official MA, and perhaps that process might take another year after that. So in terms of material, we're kind of, I don't have a lot of time to give you everything we've thought about teaching the candidates over the last year, but we would use a tool called GoReact, and it's quite a useful tool which has been developed specifically to train sign language interpreters online. So what I can do as a student is film myself signing, or I can watch a professor signing. I can then upload my material. And then as a teacher or a student, I can add notes in real time to each of the videos. And it will record me signing or speaking. So it's quite a diverse and useful tool for teaching, analysis, testing, and so on. And then obviously we have the ever-present Zoom and Zoom webinar options to teach from, which means that we can, as we are today, use spoken and sign languages together. Perhaps in future, when we have the MA, we might have a hybrid program, which would be both online and in-person teaching. Quickly, this is what our draft curriculum looks like presently. ECMI has their own curriculum, and what we tried to do was adapt it to make sure it was up to standards, as well as thinking about deaf interpreters and the needs of sign languages in general. So you have unilateral, bilateral interpreting, and then you have the different modes mixed in there as well. So we wanted to make sure that we can give people placement and observation. So some work at the UN, and I've been in contact with them. Also, obviously, we would work with the Commission to offer those experiences as well. So in a nutshell, this common adage in the United Kingdom where we tell people to keep calm and carry on. I would like to say, let's keep calm with the H and carry on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gemini, for that wonderful and inspiring presentation. And you kept right on time. So thank you so much. I'm sure people have many questions for you. So I would like to remind everyone, if you have a question specifically for Gemini or any of the other panelists, please go to Slido, SLI.do online, and then you type in our number, which is SLCI 1902. And then you can access and you can ask any question that you want, and you can also upvote the questions. Which question do you want to be answered first? And we will answer the questions after the panelists have spoken. If you have any questions in Spanish or Portuguese, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A in Zoom session itself. So Slido is either an app or it's just you can access it via the URL online. So the other question that I had is if this session is available afterwards. We are recording the session, so you can also watch it later still. If you have to go earlier, not a problem. We have time later to watch it. So, okay, so now I would like to go on to our third panelist today, which is Kathy Pearson from DG SCIC from the European Commission. She's the deputy head of the multilingualism unit. Hi, Kathy. And she is responsible for sign language interpreter training support. Kathy is an interpreter of spoken languages. She's a trainer, a very active one. I always see her mock conferences pass by on Twitter as well. And she's the deputy head of the unit, and she's responsible for all the support activities with SCIC. And I'm sure she can tell you a whole lot more in detail. Kathy, the floor is yours. Please go ahead. You can share your screen with your PowerPoint, or I think Agnes will do that for you. Yes.
Yes. Thank you, Agnes, for helping me. And good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to have been invited to speak to you today about what SCIC is doing to help with professionalization and curriculum design for sign language interpretation. Perhaps I should start by just explaining who we are and what SCIC is. I realize that I don't have a slide on this, but I can certainly add it afterwards if that's useful. I'm so used to speaking to people who know what SCIC is, but I've been looking at the chat and seeing where everybody's from and thinking maybe just briefly I should say who we are and what we do. I think the first thing to point out is that whilst we are involved in a lot of training, excuse me, we're not actually a training institute, of course, at all. Far from it. We are, in fact, an employer, the biggest employer of conference interpreters in the world by a long way. Conference interpreters for spoken languages mostly, it's true, but increasingly conference interpreters for sign language. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So as Gemini already said, SCIC is the interpreting service of the European Commission. We service several institutions, though, not just the European Commission. And we've always been very active in trying to make the profession of the interpreter visible, respected, and so on. And to that end, we actually helped set up the European Masters in Conference Interpreting many years ago. We still partially fund the EMCI and we help them with their training activities. I gave a training session in Budapest a couple of years ago for the EMCI as well. So we cover the 24 official spoken languages as well as non-EU languages, but also sign language. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. So Agnes, if I could have the next slide, please. So as Gemini already said, indeed, there are more and more requests for sign language interpreting at our high-level conferences in the EU, and that does tend to be for international sign. And so what we are doing in SCIC is responding to that request by trying to expand the pool of IS interpreters, and I'll be telling you in a moment about our mentoring scheme. Sorry, could you just go back to the previous slide, Agnes? Thank you. So expanding the pool of interpreters, adding international sign to the speech repository, which is a huge database with practice speeches. We're funding, partially funding the course in Heriot-Watt, and we're also promoting sign language interpreting on our Knowledge Centre. Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of how much sign language interpretation we have, of course, it's small compared to the amount of interpreting we do with spoken languages, it's true. But I think what's interesting for you here is to see that indeed what Gemini said was true, and we're seeing more and more requests for meetings with sign language interpretation. 2020 was a big leap. Next slide. And that, to some extent, you can click through a couple of times, please, Ines. And again, that's it. Thank you. Sorry, I should be doing this myself. It would be easier. So, in fact, there's Oliver, who we just heard, interpreting for Gemini. So the press conferences in the commission, they happen well, they happen every day, but the main one happens once a week. And the new president, Ursula von der Leyen, insisted on that being interpreted into international sign, which we are all, of course, very pleased about. So that, to some extent, explains the big increase in the request for IS interpreting. But it's not just there, it's in several other meetings as well, including a number of meetings that we have organized. So my unit in the SCIC, we had an online event with our partner universities in December, where we requested IS interpreting. And in fact, I see the same interpreters, Tina and Lera and Oliver, that we had there as well. So it's a great pleasure to see you again. And also we had a big event in January as well, where we were precisely talking about accessibility through sign language interpreting. And of course, that was interpreted into and out of international sign as well. So I think feel that there's a real momentum at the moment, and we want to really pick up on that and move along with it. So next slide, please, Ines. So one of the main things that we did last year was to set up a mentoring scheme for international sign. So as we heard actually from Nadja earlier, that there aren't any courses really training people for international sign and conference interpreting at the moment. There's EUMASLI, of course, but really specifically for that, there wasn't really anything available, which is why we decided to take 4 mentees. There were lots of applications, so the selection process was tough. But Mark Schofield, who's here helping us with the technology today, was one of those mentees. And in fact, you can see their mugshots on the picture there. The 4 mentees are at the top, and the 4 interpreters, 3 of whom are with us today, are at the bottom. So it was actually, though, Maya de Wit, our dear Maya, who was, of course, behind all of this. I helped put it together. We helped with the funding, but it was Maya, of course, who led that program together with her interpreter colleagues, and also together with the support of the European Union of the Deaf and European Union of the Deaf Youth. They were very involved in the training as well. Next slide, please, Agnes. So here we can see just some photos of what the training looked like. I think that's Go React that you see there as well. So the first 2 weeks were in situ. It was before COVID. There's always a pre and post COVID world, right? And so post-COVID, we carried on with the interpreting online, remotely, and in fact, the event that I was just telling you about that took place in January was the closing event of the scheme. It came to a very successful end with the 4 mentees, all 4, being added to SCIC's books. So we're delighted with that. I know that at least 2 of them have already had contracts, and the plan is to get them on board as quickly as possible. And well, I guess reap the fruits of our labors and the yield on our investment as well. You know, SCIC is, as I said, it's an employer, and what we're doing is not always altruistic. All the help that we give is because we have a vested interest. Of course, we have a vested interest in having the best possible interpreters working for us. We don't accredit sign language interpreters as such, but you know, with references and from word of mouth, and that now through this scheme, we are sort of professionalizing as well our list. But we do also absolutely encourage all of the sign language interpreters on our books to go through the WASLI WFD accreditation. So we're very much, you know, in line with what they're doing as well. So then the next slide, I have to keep an eye on the time. Oh my goodness, I'm about to run out of time. Could I have the next slide? And yes, please. I can't see the next slide. I don't know if you can see it. Yes, and click through again, please, a couple of times. And again, thank you, stop. Back. So the speech repository, very quickly, I'm sure you've all heard of it. If you just Google speech repository, you'll find it. There's lots and lots of practice speeches on there in all of the languages that I mentioned before. So the 24 official languages, other languages, and now international sign as well. In fact, there are 50 recorded speeches for international sign there. So any of you wanting to practice international sign can go there and have a look at those speeches. And well, you can practice both ways. Of course, you can practice from international sign, but also into international sign using the other speeches. And our plan is for national sign languages to be added as well. Of course, we're not in any way prioritizing international sign. It's just that those are the requests that come in, and we are a demand-driven service, so we just respond to demand. We don't drive it ourselves. Next slide, please. And yes. Well, we don't need to talk too much about that because Gemini has already mentioned it. But indeed, we are involved in supporting the new Masters in Sign Language Interpreting in conferences, which is something which is very dear to our hearts indeed. Next slide. Then I mentioned briefly already the Knowledge Center. I think last week when I looked, there's a carousel at the top with news, and I think 4 out of the 10 were about sign language interpreting. So we're trying to give visibility to sign language, and you know, Gemini said as well that in the past they've been in silos. You know, we've had spoken language conference interpreting and then sign language interpreting, and you know, as if they were separate things. They're not. It's all about conference interpreting. So on the Knowledge Center, there's a lot of information. There's the web stream links to both of the events that I mentioned, where we had international sign interpreting. So you can go and find them. I would urge you to go and look at the KCI, we call it for short. You can just Google it, and you'll find it. And there's a lot of information on there about interpreting, you know, really, you know, as a whole, not just conference interpreting, also public service interpreting and legal interpreting, spoken language interpreting, sign language interpreting. Lots of resources on there. So I would urge you to go on that. It's totally open access. So the last slide, I think now, Ines, I'm sort of rushing at the end. I've told you what we're doing, but maybe just briefly to remind you why we're doing it. As I've said, it's not entirely altruistic. It's because we need good interpreters. We need to be able to meet the demand. That demand is increasing. But we also need to make sure that the quality is good, because we need to make sure that our customers are satisfied. And to that end, we're helping to train language interpreters, contributing to curriculum design. And all of this together increases the professionalization, we think. And last but not least, we also want to help to raise awareness, because, you know, why are we doing this? It's all about safeguarding accessibility for the deaf community to our meetings, to information, and that is something that we are really very attached to. So sorry, I slightly went over time, but I'm very happy to answer any questions if any come later on. Thank you, and thank you, Ines.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for a wonderful presentations. I think that there's a lot of new information out there. The more that people know about the Knowledge Center, about the KCI, I think all of you should go there and find out what a rich resource that is. Our next presenter is Professor Dr. Christian Rathmann. He comes to us from the University of Humboldt, Berlin. Professor Rathmann is someone with an incredible wealth of experience. He himself is an interpreter, researcher, and interpreter trainer, amongst the many other hats that he wears. Professor Rathmann set up one of the first training programs for deaf interpreters in Europe. And thanks to him, we see many more accredited colleagues working in sign languages. In the German government, there is an accreditation for interpreters, and Christian is one of the few who holds that accreditation. Over to you, Christian.
Muchas gracias, Maya. Es un placer estar formando parte de este panel. Creo que este es un evento muy importante, justo en este momento también es muy pertinente la discusión. Yo no voy a tener ningún PowerPoint, simplemente voy a intervenir. Un momento.
Sorry to interrupt you, Christian. I think perhaps our audience is surprised to hear you speaking in Spanish. So I will go back and preface your presentation with a little bit of explanation on how we can all understand Professor Rathmann. So we have, of course, on the bottom, you have your interpretation button where you can choose which language you would like to listen to Christian in, or you can do as I am doing and watching you in international sign.
Estupendo. Muchísimas gracias una vez más a Maya por organizar este panel y por permitirme formar parte del mismo. Quiero agradecer también a DG SKIC por haber llevado a cabo este programa de formación para formar así a intérpretes de signos internacionales que puedan trabajar en las instituciones europeas. Creo que esta es una gran iniciativa y quiero agradecer a la Comisión Europea por haber tomado ese camino. Es muy interesante escuchar también a Gemini y ver cómo hay nuevos proyectos formativos, un nuevo máster para la interpretación de lengua de signos en conferencias, así que creo que estamos viviendo un momento vibrante en nuestra comunidad. Cuando hablamos de interpretación de lengua de signos en contextos de conferencias, creo que es importante tener en cuenta que a nivel europeo nos encontramos con gran heterogeneidad. Hay programas formativos a nivel universitario, grados universitarios de 3 o 4 años. Como ha comentado Nadja antes.
Apologies, Christian. Really, could the Spanish speaking interpreter change the channel so that we are able to listen to your presentation in English?
1, 2, check, check. Are you getting the English channel? Thank you. Thank you. 1, 2,
Okay,
3.
Great.
Thank you.
Apologies again for the multiple interruptions. Go ahead.
Ningún problema, Maya, disculpada.
No problem, Maya.
Vuelvo a comenzar. Agradecer
I will start
a Maya por
again.
organizado este panel, por permitirme-
Thank you, Maya, for organizing this panel. Thank you very much. It is high time to have this discussion so we can move on into how to professionalize sign language interpreting in conference settings. I would like to thank SKIC for having this idea and have sign language as part of their options in their programs. It is very important that we have more trainings so that we can have a larger roster of professionals available for high-level conferences and meetings. I believe that the profession is growing and we are witnessing a very interesting moment in the history of sign language. I would like to touch on a variety of issues. First of all, I would like to share with you how the profession has evolved in the area of conference interpreting and sign language. We have different programs in a variety of universities. Most of them are graduate studies. And some of the challenges that we face is that we have a 3 to 4 year programs. As my colleague from the Czech Republic, Nadja, shared, that makes things difficult because the candidates that join these programs learn sign language at the same time they learn interpreting and translation skills. Therefore, it ends up with a very complex reality to deal with. In my experience, this type of programs pose a variety of difficulties. Therefore, the University of Berlin, in which I'm faculty, we have decided to change the structure. We don't have a university degree that is targeted to sign language. What we do first is to have an undergraduate for deaf community studies. Therefore, our students have an initial access to the culture of the deaf, signs, and have the basics before they decide to move on into acquiring interpreting and translation skills. It is of the utmost importance that they learn about the deaf community, the social mores of the deaf community, so they can then aspire to be interpreters. That is why we decided to go with this step-by-step approach. We start with an undergraduate degree and then specialization takes place with a master's in sign language interpreting. This master is offered by the University of Berlin, and in our experience, we can say that this is the best structure to use because it provides students with a solid foundation through their undergraduate 3-year program. So afterwards, they can hone their interpreting skills during the years of the masters, and they also specialize in health issues, in media interpreting and legal interpreting. It is worthwhile mentioning as well how the basic skills that they are taught based on the knowledge of the deaf community serves as a springboard for interpreting. It has worked very well to step the skills up this way. In terms of the best methodology to train sign language interpreters, we have realized that when we already have linguistic skills in place, it's completely different compared to those candidates who lack the basic structure of sign language. The Council of Europe, through the process to standardize different languages runs from A1 to C2 and measures different levels of mastery in other languages. It has been revised and it has been used as a foundation for sign language as well. We use the European framework, which is a very important benchmark to identify the process to certify the level of mastery needed for sign language interpreting. And sometimes we have seen cases that those students that are part of the program, they might reach a B2 level or D1 at a maximum, but we need to identify the way to make this level of mastery even higher so they can move up to a C2, which would be the optimal level for interpreting. In terms of sign language interpreters' profile, most of the times we run into cases of L2, M2. These are individuals who have learned sign language as a second language and a second modality as well. This means that the process to acquire the language varies compared to sign language natives. We have realized that this is the profile that we get most in our candidates, and it's very interesting to think about why that gap, so to speak, or why is it that L1, M1 candidates are not the majority? That is to say, sign language natives and M1 natives. When we go through the IEIC standards and the way they classify their language combinations, you have the A, B, or C languages. It is common practice that A is your native language. And it is interesting because in the case of sign language interpreters, that is an exception to speak sign language as an A. Therefore, we have a big difference when we compare the situation of spoken languages and sign languages. It is a good area to think what would be the best way to get more L1 and M1 candidates. That is what we're looking for. We want that share of our candidates to be trained as interpreters. It is very important to have more deaf professionals and deaf interpreters. We haven't seen them much in our programs. If we want to talk about professionalization, we need to work in tandem with the deaf. And as I said, we have an underrepresentation of L1, M1 candidates, and we need to deal with the issues when you get candidates with L2 and M2 in our programs. Now let's talk about conference interpreting. It is very important that we use evidence-based training. We need research and practice go hand in hand in our programs. And all of the research that derived from spoken language should be used as well in sign language. And we need to translate all of these findings into training. These three areas, in my opinion, need to be taken into consideration. The academia needs to work together with practitioners as well as the trainers of the future generations of interpreters. It is very important to create partnerships with spoken language interpreting programs. And we need to learn from them as well. We have a collaboration agreement with Leipzig University, and it is very interesting to find the way to exchange experiences because we practice the same profession. It might be the case that we use different modes, but we are in the same boat. Conference interpreting is using technology more than ever. We can use teleprompters or auto cue teleprompters and resources that need to be used, and interpreters need to learn how to use these devices, because in their practice they're going to be using this technology and they need to know how to use this technology beforehand. Me, myself, I've run into situations like this. During COVID, we have press releases, our government officials give messages, and interpreters who work in these settings, they need to know what kind of technology will be used, and they need to be aware of the possibilities that technology can give. We are seeing a lot of changes, and we need to identify what are the tools that sign language interpreters will need, and we have to take that to the classroom. And I believe that is the same situation for spoken language interpreters. In order to wrap up, I would like to say that one of the areas that we could add into our debate as well is that when we talk about conference interpreting, it is not always being on stage. There are interpreters that work outside the stage. Some of them are visible, but it is very interesting to consider other types of sign language interpreting that takes place in the framework of a conference. But some interpreters are in their booth, but there are other types of interpreting that it is provided for one person only. So the resources that we use when we are using a booth or when we are using remote interpreting and we are broadcasting live, it is very different. One of the examples that I would like to share with you, in Brazil, for example, we have sign language interpreters who are not working from the stage. They have their own booth, just as spoken language interpreters have, but they are not in the same room. They have their own booth, and from there, they broadcast their interpretation. I believe that there are many variations of how we perform our services that we need to analyze as well. The presence of international sign language is very important to also analyze. It is very important to have international signs interpreters, but sometimes the organizers or individuals that want to make their meetings language accessible, they are unaware of the needs of the deaf. I believe that we need to also identify the local needs of the meetings, because sometimes the local needs of the deaf are overlooked. Sometimes we see international signs linked to American Sign Language, and I believe that it is interesting to talk about this, and we should consider other combinations, probably international signs into German or into Spanish or English. We need to broaden up the scope of ASL, and the international signs should not be, and ASL should not be the only combination. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christian. There are so many options, and there have been a few questions that have come up on Slido during your presentation, and hopefully we'll get to answer those questions a bit later. We'll move on to the next panelist. Now we have Miriam Vermeerbergen. She comes to us from Belgium. She is based at the University KU Leuven. She works in the Faculty of Arts. She was the previous chair of the sign language group there and is now vice dean in charge of education. Miriam, over to you.
It's in Flanders, which is the northern part of Belgium. So the training of sign language interpreters in Flanders started some 40 years ago already, when the very first official so-called interpreter for the deaf training was set up in Ghent. It was a part-time program, and at the time it was at the level of secondary education. Now, actually 2 years before that, a similar but originally non-official program had already started in Mechelen. Both these programs later became part of a Center for Adult Education, but they remained part-time vocational programs. Towards the end of the 90s then, there was a request for sign language interpreters to be trained at the same level as spoken language interpreters, which implied that we needed academic sign language interpreter training. Now, at that time, we were trained at university colleges, and the training was a 4-year program comparable to what is now a bachelor-master program. We contacted several university colleges that were training spoken language interpreters to see if they were interested in training sign language interpreters as well. But mainly because there was no additional governmental funding to set up such a program, our attempts were not very successful. In 2007 then, my colleague Miriam Vermeerbergen from Ghent University and myself decided to give it one more go. And we first returned to the institution that had been most positive about the idea, which was Lessius University College. The then head of department, Professor Frida Steurs, very much liked the idea of training sign language interpreters, and the board of the college decided that in 2008, 2009, they would integrate Flemish Sign Language in their programs, and I was hired to do that. So I will now use some of the slides that Frida Steurs used in those days to present the programs at Lessius University College in Antwerp. So the Department of Applied Language Studies at Lessius University College offered a 3-year bachelor program of applied language studies, 4 master programs, and 3 postgraduate programs. In 2008, so when Flemish Sign Language was integrated, as a result of the European Bologna process, Lessius University College was already affiliated with KU Leuven Association, and the department was in the process of integrating into the university. Since 2013, the process is concluded and we are now part of the Faculty of Arts of KU Leuven. However, we did not physically move to Leuven, but we stayed or remained in Antwerp. So as I said, the Department of Applied Language Studies offered a 3-year bachelor program of applied language studies, 4 master's programs, including a master in interpreting, and 3 postgraduate programs. On this slide, you can see in which of the programs Flemish Sign Language was to be integrated. In red means that the integration was intended from the start. So in 2008, it was decided to integrate Flemish Sign Language in the bachelor and in the master in interpreting. Yellow or orange means that it was yet to be decided whether Over time, Flemish Sign Language would also be integrated in the Master in Translation, the Master in Multilingual Communication, and in the Postgraduate in Conference Interpreting. In the 3-year bachelor program of applied language studies, students study 3 languages. So they take Dutch as their first language or mother tongue. As a second language, they either pick French, English, or German, which is one of the languages that are already offered in secondary school in Belgium. And then they pick a third language, which can either be a second school language or one of these so-called exotic sign languages that you see on the slide. In 2008, that the languages were Russian, Arabic, Hungarian, Italian, Spanish, and then of course Flemish Sign Language starting from 2008. For the exotic languages, so Flemish Sign Language became one of the exotic languages in the program. For the exotic languages, the bachelor program, each year of the bachelor program included 3 components. There was language acquisition, linguistics, and culture. And the idea was that this would be the same for Flemish Sign Language with the same amount of credits and the same amount of teaching hours. In the Master in Interpreting at the time, it was a 1-year program, and actually it still is a 1-year program of 60 credits. And it consisted of 3 main components: a more theoretical component, also called the academic component, a more practical component, and students are required to write a master dissertation. Lessius also offered a postgraduate in conference interpreting, but in 2008, there was no immediate intention of integrating Flemish Sign Language into that program, mainly because the program concentrated on the working languages of the interpreters in European institutions, and at the time, Flemish Sign Language was not one of these languages. As you can see on this slide, the number of credits, and more importantly, of course, the number of teaching hours for the different sign language related courses was very limited. For example, in the first year that we integrated Flemish Sign Language in Bachelor 1, we only had 3 hours of Flemish Sign Language acquisition classes a year. And in the Master in Interpreting, for example, there were just only 2 hours of teaching for each of the foreign languages that a student had chosen. This meant that there were only 2 hours of teaching Flemish Sign Language interpreting in the master program. At the time, there was also no work placement or internship in the master program. My time is limited, so I'll fast forward to today, and I will look back at what we've done. First of all, is integrating a signed language in an existing training program for spoken language interpreters a good idea? Yes, I believe it is. In Flanders, Belgium, as at the time there were no additional financial means available for colleges or universities that decided to train sign language interpreters, I actually believe that this was the only way to organize academic training for sign language interpreters. Also, I believe that having a program for sign language interpreters or a department or a center integrated within a larger department or a larger structure makes it less vulnerable. Now, are there challenges when you decide to integrate a signed language in an existing program training spoken language interpreters? Definitely yes. For us, the major challenges included obstacles to hiring deaf staff members, but also, and maybe even more importantly, the very limited number of credits and very limited number of teaching hours for the exotic languages in the curriculum. especially for signed language acquisition and signed language interpreting. Another issue that we had to deal with was the fact that in the general courses, for example, in general linguistics or in Introduction to Translation Studies, at the start, there was no attention for signed languages or signed language interpreting, and some of the information was even inaccurate. Now, if we look at the curriculum today, the most important changes in the bachelor relate to the number of teaching hours and to the fact that the colleagues who are teaching general courses are now including information on signed language linguistics and on sign language interpreting into their classes. In the Master in Interpreting too, there are more teaching hours today, and we now have a, be it limited, work placement integrated in the program. Another very important change is that we have a new postgraduate program in Flemish Sign Language Interpreting, because our students come with zero knowledge of Flemish Sign Language when they enter the program, and we soon realized that 4 years of training was not enough. Also because, as I already said, our students study Dutch, another spoken language, and Flemish Sign Language. So originally we attempted to integrate Flemish Sign Language in the postgraduate program for conference interpreters that we were offering, but that was not very successful. And so it was decided to set up a special postgraduate program in Flemish Sign Language Interpreting. It's a limited program, you could say, 24 credits. And it consists of 2 courses in simultaneous, mainly conference interpreting, and a traineeship, which is supervised by professional interpreters. And I'm very happy to say that very soon we will have our first PhD student presenting her work and obtaining a, hopefully obtaining a doctoral degree. A big challenge for us is the fact that our students in the Master in Interpreting program also train to become spoken language interpreters, which makes it difficult for us to implement changes in the curriculum. Now, fortunately, we are currently in the process of reviewing the curricula for all our programs, for the bachelor and for the 4 master programs. And for the Master in Interpreting, the idea is to offer students the choice between either continuing with Dutch and the 2 additional languages or selected only 1, which would offer us an opportunity to train students who have selected Dutch and only Flemish Sign Language, which will allow us for more opportunities to adapt the curriculum to the needs of signed language interpreters. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. Time is running.
Yeah.
Can you finish? Maybe a last few words, please.
Yes, I only have one more sentence, and that is that we are currently looking for funding for a specific program for deaf interpreters, because in Belgium too we have deaf interpreters who are already practicing but did not receive any training. And this is it. Thank you very much. Feel free to comment or ask questions if there's still time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. That was wonderful. And I think very much needed to get a concrete example of what is possible and how you've done it. If you don't mind turning off your video and muting yourself, then I can welcome the next panel member, which is Nora Ungar. Hi, Nora. Nora is president of the Hungarian Association of Sign Language Interpreters. She is actually an EMCI graduate, which is great to have you there. So she's also a sign language interpreter herself, and she will bring that perspective to you. Over to you, Nora.
Thank you very much, Maya. I would just quickly share my screen so that my presentation will be visible for all. And I would also like to greet all the participants of this webinar. I'm really moved by the big number of participants. And I've seen many friends from decades before in the list of participants. So before I would start, my presentation would be very practical and down to earth, if you would like. I will be talking about my experience as a sign language interpreter in the EMCI, the European Masters of Conference Interpreters training here in Budapest. And just to give you a little about my background, I have earned my sign language interpreter qualification in the last millennia, and for years I was working together with deaf people. I was also involved in the curriculum development of the vocational training of sign language interpreters in Hungary, but I only started interpreting a couple of years ago. And why I enrolled to EMCI, I had two motivations. One, I was very curious to see how spoken language interpreters are trained. And it was also a personal challenge for me. I was really curious to see how would I fare in the training. And Ildiko may have mentioned it in the beginning. In the EMCI training, students have at least 3 working languages. Mine were Hungarian, English, and Italian. And now I would talk about the 3 main areas where I have benefited from the EMCI training, participating in a spoken language interpreter training. And I have to stress that the first thing I learned is that spoken language interpreting and sign language interpreting is very different. For example, if you're looking at consecutive interpreting with note-taking, which is a common practice among spoken language interpreters and especially conference interpreters, this is basically non-existent in sign language interpreting because the 2 channels, the auditory channel and the visual channel, do not interfere. So sign language interpreters almost never have to interpret stretches longer than 3 sentences consecutively. So this was a completely new field for me. The other thing what was unusual, we would say, is verbal accuracy, because while we're doing sign language interpreting, we're often trying to pass with, oh, we don't have a sign for that. And we are falling back on interpreting strategies very often, like omission or approximation or paraphrasing. However, in spoken language interpreting, and especially in conference interpreting, striving for equivalence is a must. And this leads to the next thing, which conference interpreting in spoken languages needs constant preparation, both in topics, both in scripts, hunting for terminology and activating related vocabulary. It's a never-ending labor. However, sign language interpreting are interpreting in, I would say, at least in Hungary, 80% of the time in community interpreting settings. And although we are trying to press sign language interpreting students to prepare, to practice preparing, in reality, the community interpreting settings are so different, and sometimes they are so unpredictable or so little information is available. Sign language lexicon is kind of, the availability is limited. So preparation is not really a second nature of sign language interpreters in community interpreting settings. So I would say these were the 3 main areas where I have definitely learned new skills. And if you ask me how could sign language interpreters in general could benefit from the EMCI training, I would say individually they would learn the same or acquire the same skills as I did. I think they would also learn a new profession, we could say, because interpreting in a spoken language is like a new profession for them, but they would also acquire transferable skills. This is important. Like also myself, I'm working very often between English and Hungarian Sign Language. So basically I could transfer my interpreting skills onto new language combinations. And it is very important that earning a new degree in spoken language interpretation or in conference interpretation would also give freelance sign language interpreters a new source of income, which is important when work is scarce. And as a professional community, I would say that sign language interpreters could benefit if the routines and skills of conference interpreting can transpire into interpreting in education and in the media. And it would definitely elevate professional standards. I would also hope that if there were sign language interpreting students in the EMCI course, the week after week preparation in terminology in different topics would lead to a concerted effort into developing terminologies in sign language. And I think it's very important to note that including sign language and international sign into the EMCI training can be a shortcut to third level interpreter training for sign language interpreters in those countries where sign language interpreting is only a vocational course, so a much lower level training, or where there's no sign language interpreter training at all. For example, in the joining European Union countries and so on. And if you ask me how EMCI or the EMCI consortium or institutions can benefit from including sign language or international sign into the offered palette of languages, I would say that luckily it would not require structural changes in the existing EMCI training, for example, in Budapest. But it would definitely give a plus or an extra for students and an awareness and experience to work in interpreters in mixed different modalities. So that would definitely be a gain for students. And also involving deaf sign language lecturers or deaf interpreting students into the cohort of students and lecturers would bring in deaf perspective. And this would give an insight for both students and fellow lecturers into the perspective of a very underrepresented and special group of clients. So I think this would also be a major addition. And finally, I collected a couple of points for consideration where I think at least the existing training in Hungary could be maybe accommodated to include sign language into the palette. And the first thing is I would suggest EMCI training for sign language interpreters who already have a vocational qualification. And the reason for this is that EMCI training is relatively short and very practical. And as I mentioned before, sign language interpreters are working in community interpreting settings. So usually their training involves a lot of academic knowledge, just as Miriam has mentioned before me about deaf culture and sign linguistics and so on, which EMCI cannot include. It's just the time is too short for that. So I would suggest it for sign language interpreters to improve themselves. And I would include in the EMCI curriculum the ethics of community interpreting, because sign language interpreters, even if their degree will be about conference interpreting, they will be still qualified to work in community interpreting settings. So I think it's necessary to prepare them a little bit for these scenarios as well. And for sign language interpreters, ethics is crucial because they are working with a vulnerable group. And another practical suggestion would be that those classes which are assigned to practice consecutive interpreting by languages, at least that's how it worked in the Budapest training, could be transferred into community interpreting practice for the sign language cohort. So these would be my 3 suggestions. And these were basically my experiences and my suggestions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nora, for that really nice overview of the ECMI and your own experience. I think it's the first time that we're hearing that the sign language interpreters are getting this same experience. One question that I saw come up in the chat, just for clarity, in Christian's presentation, and maybe Christian, you can pop up here for a second just to answer. Great. One of the questions that came up in the chat asks that in one of your slides, you say L1, M1, and that M represents modality. And if that is right, can you explain a little bit about what modality means in terms of language combinations?
Por supuesto, de manera breve, cuando hablo de modalidad, me refiero a la manera
Of course, when I speak about modality, I refer to the way of perceiving and producing that language. Is it from the oral and auditory modality, and then the visual and spatial modality, which is that one that applies for sign languages. So this is why I say that most sign language interpreters learn sign language as their second language, as their L2, and as their second modality, because their first modality would be spoken. So I just thought it was interesting to reflect on the idea that there are people who have sign language as their first language, as their first modality, and that it is also very interesting to include this other perspective in the profession.
Great, thank you for that clarification, Professor Rathman. The next question is for Gemini, if you wouldn't mind popping yourself up as well. Hi, Gemina. I know we're a little late on time, but there was a question for you. The topic of CALM, Conference and High Level Interpreting, what are some more topics other than ones to do with politics, for example, that would be included in these trainings? High-level interpreting for me makes me think of meetings in the Commission, in the European Parliament, essentially any meeting which is held on a global platform. So UN institutional meetings such as the ITU, conferences, yes, but we also have, like we do today, you have conferences, but that aren't necessarily labeled conferences. So what we do is then call them high-level meetings. So the work is as strenuous as conference interpreting, and it can range to different topics. It can be quite technical, or it can be general, but I think they're all quite demanding. So that would be my thought in a nutshell. Thank you, Gemina, for answering that question. Oh, we have another question coming to us from Ljubljana University. And they're wondering how to incorporate sign language interpreting into their conference interpreting program. They're wondering if they can ask the European Commission for funding to be able to do that. So perhaps, Kathy, you might have an answer to that.
Hi, yes, I'll try and answer that. I mean, what I can say for now is that we have a grant program under which the Harriet Watt course is being funded, and there are 3 different types of courses that can be funded there. One is a master's course in conference interpreting. The second is a project rather like the EMCI Consortium that are focused on bringing together different institutions training interpreters. And the third are these special projects which which contribute to the professionalization of the interpreting profession as a whole, and which create synergies with other types of interpreting. And I can certainly see that either under the first one, the Masters in Conference Interpreting, or under the third one, a course like that could fall under the eligibility criteria for a grant. We haven't as yet funded a course like that, I think perhaps because they don't exist yet. So can't promise anything, but I could envisage that that might be possible, yes.
I know that we are already over time, so I'd like to proceed with a closing and a few points. A lot of us are thinking how to move ahead and to incorporate sign languages into our trainings. I think the first step to all of this is changing the mentality toward educating interpreters in general. I think if there are many people who live in your area, in your country, that sign and speak and are interested in interpreting, you can take, these minority groups and give them an opportunity. And that is the way that we can encourage sign languages to be incorporated into our university programs. The UNCRPD does state in one of its articles about accessibility, which is Article 9, that states specifically have to provide professional sign language interpreting services. So this is a bona fide piece of evidence that you can use to lobby your efforts when asking your government for funding to be able to incorporate sign language interpreters and interpreting into your teaching curriculums. So it's not just a bunch of hot air. I think that if you reach out to stakeholders in the community, including signers, both deaf and hearing, you will realize that there is a demand for increased training of sign language interpreters in all areas. So I think it's important not to forget these players and not to think that this is just another administrative step. So for me, this has been very, very inspiring, and I hope it has been for you as well in our ongoing work. And it doesn't stop here. I hope that we can all rewatch this video if we need to. If we have more questions and we want to email some of the panelists, we will be able to do that. There'll be more information coming after the webinar is finished. I would like to thank ECMI for putting this on their agenda, which means that there has been a change of framework. So can we please put up our videos? Ildiko, can you put up your video, please?
Yes, I'm here. And according to our script, I think it is up to me to close this webinar. And I think that we can safely say that mentality change is needed, but we can also safely say that professionalization, training, and research go hand in hand. And also that it is true for it was true for spoken language conference interpreting and interpreting in general, and it is also true for sign language interpreting as well, international or national sign languages. We will do our best. That's all I can tell you by way of conclusion, I am sure. And I would like to, I would like to reassure you as well that I think if it depends on me and on the EMCI, it is only the first in the series of webinars or meetings or projects that we organize on this subject. On a personal note, I would like to say that I got acquainted with the sign language interpreters' work, and I was fascinated by this work or with this work while I was in the booth working at a multilingual conference in Hungary, organized by the Institute of Linguistics of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And I was really amazed, and I really saw the differences, but the similarities also between the two modes of working in conferences. Nora has mentioned some of them, actually. I would like to thank everybody for their participation, all the panelists, all our team behind the scene, but also I would like to thank those who have attended this seminar, because without you, it would have been an empty room. We would have been speaking to each other, to ourselves, but thank you for your interest, because your interest gives us a lot of energy and encouragement to continue in the future as well. I think we have been able to get the ball rolling, but the show must go on, and I'm sure the show will go on, and the exchange will go on from now. But for now, I would like to say goodbye from Budapest, Hungary, in Central Europe. I would like to thank you once more for having been with us for the last 90 minutes, and goodbye. Thank you very much.